Well, there may be some of you here for the first time today who sat down in the pew and opened up your bulletin, and you saw those headers that say, "Deny yourself and take up your cross." And maybe you thought to yourself, "I must be in the wrong place. I thought this was the progressive church." Well, I promise you, you are in the right place, so you don't have to go running for the exit. Okay? These words of Jesus are very, very challenging, though, and today we're going to look at them from a higher perspective. These words are the words that are a continuation of last Sunday's gospel. And if you were here last Sunday, you know that I quoted from Father Richard Rohr. Now, if you don't know who that is, Richard Rohr is a best-selling author. He's written lots of books. Oprah sat down with him for an hour for her Super Soul Sunday TV series. And Father Richard Rohr is a Franciscan priest who founded a center in New Mexico called the Center for Action and Contemplation. And a group of 20 of us from Douglas UCC got to visit Richard Rohr in New Mexico last fall. The quote that I gave last Sunday from Richard Rohr is, "Jesus didn't want fans. Jesus wanted followers." And I thought we could explore that a bit more today, because in today's gospel, Jesus talks about what it means to be a follower of his. But before we get to follower, let's look at fan. What is a fan? Well, I looked it up in the dictionary. It says that fan is short for fanatic or fanaticism. And this is the definition: marked by excessive enthusiasm and often intense, uncritical devotion, extreme and uncritical zeal, excessive intolerance of opposing views. And it comes from the Latin word fanaticus, a word that means madness. So think about a fan of a certain sports team or a fan of a certain singer. They may paint their faces, wear jerseys or concert tees. They may memorize all of their stats and their song lyrics. They may have posters up on the walls of their house. And they go to their games or their concerts, and they cheer with great passion and emotion. Well, many Christians today are like fans, aren't they? They wear crosses around their neck. They have the Jesus fish symbol on the back of their car. They wear shirts with Bible quotes, have scripture quotes up on their walls. And they sing praise songs with their arms in the air in these big mega arenas. What was that definition again? Okay. Jesus doesn't want fans. Jesus wants followers. And in today's gospel, he says, if you want to be a follower of mine, you must deny yourself and take up your cross every day. So who's in? Who wants to be a follower? Not many of us. It's why Jesus has an awful lot of fans today, but not a lot of followers. Because being a fan is easy and it's fun. Being a follower is hard. It's why Jesus said, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Because most of us don't want to do the work it takes to be a follower. It's so much easier to just be a fan. But Jesus is calling us to follow his way. Now, I've shared with you before, I'm not a big fan of the word follower. Because I grew up and I was taught not to be a follower. I was taught to be a leader. To me, the word follower signifies somebody who's not thinking for themselves, someone who just blindly follows. That's not what Jesus is asking of us here. He's not asking you to blindly follow him. He's asking you to open up your eyes, to see clearly, and not to follow him, but to follow his way of life. And what is that way of life? Well, Sue read it for us so beautifully this morning in that first reading from Romans. It explains exactly what that way of life is. It says, to contribute to the needs of all, to extend hospitality to strangers, to bless those who persecute you, to live in harmony with one another, and to live peaceably with all. That's what it says. How many fans of Jesus do you know who actually live that? How many actually follow that? I am fortunate enough to know a handful of people who do follow that way of life. And many of them are not even Christian. And so my question for you this morning is, are you a fan or are you a follower? If you are a follower, you should be doing what Jesus said. He said today, if anyone seeks to follow me, he must deny his very self, take up his own cross every day, and follow in my steps. So let's look at what that actually means. When Jesus says to deny yourself, he's talking about denying the false self, the ego self. Now, ego is not just a 20th century psychology term. This concept of the ego has been around forever. It's in all wisdom and faith traditions. In the tradition that Jesus grew up in, Judaism, in Jewish mysticism, it's referred to as the desire to receive for self alone. That's what the ego is. The desire to receive for self alone. It's all about itself and protecting itself. Reverend Polly Moore, in our words of integration this morning, I think she described it beautifully. She said that when she was talking with her friend in need, she had an out-of-ego experience. And she says we need to have more out-of-ego experiences. And she wrote in those words that Sue read for us, as my friend wept, telling me her story, my own story evaporated. She snapped me out of my fixation on me. And as I listened to her needs, my ego self didn't matter to me. Only she mattered. Her tears crucified my ego and resurrected God. The more we can have these out-of-ego experiences, the happier we'll be. And she says that is the message of Jesus. That's why following the way of Jesus takes us out of the ego. When you love unconditionally, when you serve the least of these, when you forgive 70 times 7, when you turn the other cheek, when you bless those who persecute you, you're crucifying the ego. And you're resurrecting your true self, your Christ self, your divine self. So that's what Jesus means by denying the self. Now, what does he mean by take up your cross every day? Well, I'm sure that there were some who would say, life is suffering. This life is miserable. Everybody's got a cross to bear, and you're just going to have to take up your cross every day. I don't think that's what Jesus meant. I don't think Jesus wants us to be miserable. Jesus said, I have come that you may have life and have it to the full. That we are to enjoy this life, not be miserable. But taking up your cross is not the way of suffering, it's the way of freedom. Reverend Polly Moore said that the cross is seen in many faith and wisdom traditions. And what it always symbolizes is the crossing out of the false self and the resurrection of the divine self. Now, I've shared with you before that the cross is a symbol. The horizontal line represents our humanness. It's the earth plane, our humanness. The vertical line represents our divinity, spiritual ascension, our rising in consciousness. You cannot ascend if earthly desires and attachments are keeping you here. So when Jesus says, take up your cross, that's what he's saying. Rise above human understanding. Rise above human limitation. Rise above human attachments. When you do, you're free. It's not the way of suffering, it's the way of freedom. That's what the cross is, and it's why Jesus says in today's gospel, whoever loses himself will find himself. Because when you die to the false self, you find the true self. That's the spiritual life. Now, there was a Christian mystic, a medieval Christian mystic, who was named after the cross. He was known as John of the Cross. And John of the Cross wrote a spiritual classic book called Dark Night of the Soul. And Dark Night of the Soul is about the dissolution of the ego, the death of the ego. And John of the Cross says in that book, I have abandoned all I ever sought to be, and in dying, my spirit has been released. Now, he wrote that obviously when he was still alive. So he wasn't talking about physical death. He was talking about what many spiritual teachers throughout the centuries have talked about. It's called dying before you die. All of us, hopefully, will have little deaths before our physical deaths, And those many deaths are dying to the ego, dying to the false self. And so John of the Cross had that aha. I've abandoned all I've ever sought to be. And in dying to that, my spirit's been set free. That was the message of Jesus. Unfortunately, Christianity has been about being a fan of this one man who did this, who discovered his divinity. But Jesus didn't want fans. He wanted us to follow him. He wanted you to die to your false self so that you could resurrect your true self, your Christ self, your divine self. Now, Peter in today's gospel is still a fan of Jesus. He's not a follower yet. Now, Peter, just last Sunday, if you were here, Jesus said, Peter, you're my rock. You're the rock on which I'm going to found my church. And now this week he's calling him Satan. Get behind me, Satan, he says to Peter. Now, he's not saying that Peter is possessed by some red guy with horns and a tail and a pitchfork. Satan, again, represents that desire to receive for self alone. Peter wants things his way. My will be done, not thy will be done. And it's why Jesus calls it a stumbling block. The ego is a stumbling block. Jesus says to Peter, you are setting your mind on human things, not on divine things. When we set our mind on human things, we will experience suffering. When we set our minds on divine things, we will experience freedom. And Jesus showed us the way to that freedom, not so that we could worship him, but so that we could do as he did, follow his way. And so this week, I invite you in your alone time with God to contemplate what is your stumbling block. What is the thing that's getting in the way of your following the way? When we go into the silence, into that secret dwelling place of God, that's the place where our humanity and divinity meet. When you go to that place, you set your mind on divine things, not human things. You die more and more to the ego self. So go there this week. Set your mind on the divine. And in that meeting place, may you be transformed, and may you know the truth of your being, because that is the truth that will set you free. Namaste.